it's good you can do that.
I think you're getting McDonald's. Yeah. All right. Calling case number N15519-363 in the matter of the Blair Berry children. Petition number 15001-623. Today we're here for a continuing bench trial on original petition for permanent custody. Will all parties please state your name for the record?
Kelly McAfee, Assistant Attorney General on behalf of DHHS.
Patricia Hayden, on behalf of DHHS.
John Giancotti from Chap Guardian Ad Litem.
Adam Devlin, attorney for Alexander Dorsey.
Alexander Dorsey.
Good morning, Laura Anderson, P51285. I represent the father, Stephen Berry.
Stephen Berry.
Good morning, Your Honor. Tracy Ambar, P63745. I'm here starting at lighting for Ms. Mitchelle Blair, who appears today by video link from Huron Valley. Please state your full name for the record.
Mitchelle Blair, Matthew Gabrielle, always will be.
Good morning, Your Honor. Janice L. Burns, 35185, counsel on behalf of Mitchelle Blair.
All right, everyone can have a seat. We were last here on this matter June 30th, 2015. At that point, the court took jurisdiction over the children regarding mother and both fathers. The court also found a statutory basis for termination of rights for both mother along with fathers Dorsey and Berry and continue the matter to today's date for best interest hearing. So my understanding from our pre-conference is that we have a number of witnesses today for best interests. But before we get to that, any preliminary matters, starting with you, Ms. Megacy?
It's just that there was a sequestration order in effect for the case, and at prior proceedings, parties are all asking that that sequestration order continue. In speaking to some of the attorneys, Ms. Anthony is the foster care worker. I would submit she's a party to this case as is indicated, but the other attorneys, or at least one has indicated desire to have her sequestered. I leave that to the court.
So in the courtroom right now, we have Ms. Anthony and we also have Dr. Henry, correct?
Yes, you're
Any
right.
other potential witnesses?
All other potential witnesses have been sequestered.
Mr. Giancotti, any preliminary matters and/or statement regarding the sequestration?
Nothing at this time. I may have some other statements when other witnesses are called.
Mr. Devlin? And Ms. Anderson?
Yes, Your Honor, the court had previously sequestered the foster care worker, and I ask that that continue.
And the court will know before I get to Ms. Burns is essentially the petitioner is here and she's allowed to stay. She's protective services. The foster care worker is not the petitioner, and so pursuant to the sequestration order, the court will have her sequestered until we get to her testimony. So if you wait outside, we'll call you when we get to your testimony. Ms. Burns, any preliminary matters?
I have none, Your Honor, thank you.
Okay. Then Ms. Megacy, we'll start with your first witness.
I would call Dr. Henry to the stand.
Dr. Henry, would you come forward so you can be sworn in?
Do you swear or affirm that the testimony that you're about to give us the truth?
I do.
And please state and spell your name for the record.
James Henry, James Henry.
All right, Dr. Henry, you can have a seat here. Thank you. Ms. Megacy?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Dr. Henry, what do you do for a living?
I'm a professor at Western Michigan University, and I am also the director of the Southwest Michigan Children's Trauma Assessment Center, which is under the umbrella of Western Michigan University.
The Children's Trauma Center?
Yes.
And what is the purpose of the Children's Trauma Center?
The purpose of the Children's Trauma Center is to do neurodevelopmental trauma assessments of children who've experienced maltreatment and to understand the impact of that maltreatment.
And how do you do neurodevelopment assessments?
We have a team of pediatrician, a speech and language professor, occupational therapy professor, a social worker, myself, and several clinicians who do a transdisciplinary model of assessment, and at other times we do a abbreviated trauma assessment. So we look at the impact of trauma to learning, to relationships, to behavior, to total functioning.
And how long have you been the director of this center?
We started this center in 2000, and I have been the director since co-founding that center in 2000.
That was my next question. You were a co-founder of this center?
Yes.
Prior to being the director and co-founder of this center, what did you do for a living?
I came to Western Michigan University as a professor in school of social work in 1997, and prior to that I had spent 17 years doing child protective services as a worker and a supervisor.
Can you briefly describe your educational background?
I have a bachelor's degree in elementary education from Western Michigan University. I have a master's degree in social work from Western Michigan University. I have a postgraduate fellowship on child abuse from the University of Michigan, and I have a PhD from Michigan State in social work and developmental psychology.
Have you ever testified in a court proceeding before of this nature?
Innumerable times, yes.
Okay. Have you testified in best interest hearings?
Many times, yes.
Okay. In this courthouse?
No.
And what other courthouses?
I've testified in Washtenaw County. I've testified many, many times in Cass County, St. Joseph County, Kalamazoo County, Berrien County, Van Buren County, Allegan County, and probably 2 or 3 more.
And have you evaluated children and parents in terms of best interest hearings?
Yes.
And the purpose was to provide a recommendation to the court in terms of termination of parental rights.
That is correct.
Have you been declared an expert in any of these courts before?
In each one of those courts, yes.
And what have you been deemed an expert in?
Child maltreatment, child trauma, child sexual abuse, child development, domestic violence.
And you actually tendered me, or gave me, or someone from your staff gave me a copy of your CV, or curriculum vitae, is that correct?
That's correct.
And, Your Honor, I have what's been marked as DH as proposed exhibit number 1, which is composed of 5 different pages. It is Dr. Henry's CV or curriculum vitae. This has been provided to the attorneys. I move for its admission at this time.
All right, any objections to that?
None, Your Honor.
None, Your Honor. None, Your Honor.
All
May I
right.
approach?
Yes, it'll be admitted. Thank you.
Your Honor, subject to any further voir dire from the attorneys, I would move to qualify Dr. Henry as an expert in child maltreatment, trauma, and development at this point.
No objections, Your Honor.
Anyone else have an objection?
None, Your Honor.
All right, so you're asking for him to be qualified as an expert in child maltreatment, trauma,
And development.
and development. Okay, Dr. Henry will be so qualified without objection.
Dr. Henry, regarding this case, the children, Matthew Berry and Gabrielle Blair, are you familiar with those children?
Yes.
How are you familiar with those children?
We did an assessment of Gabrielle, and we refer to her as Gabby, so we did an assessment of Gabby on April the 8th, 2015. On that same day, my colleague and I did an evaluation of Matthew, or Maddie, on 4/8 as well.
Okay. And when you say, you initially started by saying we did an assessment, who was we?
Myself and my colleague Amy Perricone, who's in the audience now.
And Amy Perry, is it Perricone?
Perricone. Perricone, yes.
Okay. And what is her role at the trauma center?
She is a clinician at the trauma center.
And a clinician's role or responsibility at the center is to do what?
Is to participate in the assessment and the testing and the compilation of the report.
And in addition to these children, Gabby and Maddie, or Matthew, did you also conduct evaluations of Alexander Dorsey, Stephen Berry, the father, and Mitchelle Blair?
Yes, and, excuse me, and those occurred on 7/9/2015.
And was that with Ms. Perricone present also?
Yes.
So for all of those evaluations, 5 evaluations, Ms. Perricone was present?
Yes.
Okay. What was your purpose in conducting the assessment of the children?
The purpose was to understand the potential impact of the maltreatment and exposure to the death of the 2 siblings of Matthew and Gabby.
And how is it that that was done?
That was done in Detroit to reduce the stress of coming to Kalamazoo. And so we did that assessment at Kids Talk, where we met with initially Gabby for a period of about 2.5 hours, and then following that met with Matthew. And we did testing and a psychosocial interview of the children. Prior to that, there was a history taken from the great aunt, Angela, and to contextualize their behaviors prior to coming to see us for the evaluation.
So prior to speaking to either child, you spoke with the great aunt, Angela, is that correct?
That's correct, and we also spoke with the caseworker, the Child Protective Services worker, at least 2 or 3 times, again, to get a history. That's part of our assessment process, to get a history prior to the kids coming.
Okay, and when you say the caseworker, that would be Ms. Hayden?
Yes.
Hayden, okay. And did you speak with Gabby or Maddie first?
Gabby.
And you stated you did, there was testing involved?
Yes.
Is that correct, with both children?
Yes.
Same test conducted with both children?
Yes.
Can you explain what tests were?
Yes, we initially performed what's called a Kaufman Brief Intelligence Test to look at her verbal and nonverbal intelligence. And so we completed that. We completed what's called the VMI, which is a visual motor inventory, and that looks at her capacity to integrate what she sees and being able to put that on paper. We did what's called the SELF, which is a language screener, looking at expressive and receptive language. We did an executive functioning questionnaire with Gabby as well, and we also did what's called pragmatics, which is looking at a child's ability to communicate in terms of reciprocal conversation, in being able to provide a narrative, and also to be able to understand the intentions of others when communicating. Those were the testings that we did with Gabby, and we also did the same with Maddie, although the baseline was different, obviously, because their ages were different.
And when you say the executive functioning questionnaire, what is the purpose of that questionnaire?
The purpose of that questionnaire is, it's a self-report that we did with Gabby, and we did not do that with Matthew. We just did that with Gabby, all right? And it is a way to look at how the prefrontal cortex part of the brain, which is the thinking center, how they process information, how they're able to problem solve, how they're able to regulate their own emotions, and how they're able to be aware of what they're communicating. So it's a very significant process that kids and adults as well need in order to be able to problem solve.
And you stated this test was not done with Maddie or Matthew. Why is it that this test was not done with?
Because he was too young.
Is there an age requirement?
I believe it's 8 or 9, I can't say exactly, but we did not do that with him.
And why are all of these tests performed?
Well, one of the things that we know about potentially exposure to trauma, and I say trauma just so we're all on the same page, is trauma is an overwhelming event that renders a child or an adult helpless, powerless, and it continues to impact their functioning after the event is over. So even though the event is over, their perception of the world has been changed, usually to perceive danger most everywhere, and there's an ongoing fragmentation of thought that occurs in children who've experienced trauma, and in other words, having difficulty organizing their memories. And so that's what I mean by trauma. So these tests, one of the things research has demonstrated over and over again in the last 10 years, and our center has written one of those papers, is that chronic exposure to traumatic stress can affect learning, can affect the neurodevelopmental progress of children. And so our center looks at that because we believe that it's critical to understand potential neurodevelopmental impact following chronic exposure to trauma.
With respect to the testing component of your evaluation with Gabby, were there any of the tests that caused you concern? Or the results
Gabby,
from the
yeah.
test?
One of the very positive things about the findings for Gabby was that her IQ was in the normal range, and given her ongoing exposure to traumatic stress, that is definitely a strength of hers. She hadn't been to school for an extended period of time, and so the fact that her IQ is in the normal range, I believe it was 93, a composite, or 94, is a significant resiliency factor for her future. The other testing varied, but it was all still within the continuum of average. And so there was a positive findings for each of the tests for Gabby.
In terms of the evaluations of the children, you stated that the testing was a component of your evaluation, and what were the other components of this evaluation?
Was the psychosocial interview of both Gabby and Matthew.
And what happens during the psychosocial interview?
During the psychosocial interview, we probe to understand what the child's perception of his or her world is, in order to be able to understand what the impact of that trauma can be to their functioning. And so we ask questions about how they have experienced the events. So we are not detailing the events. This is not a forensic interview. It's a way to understand the impact. And so we ask questions that we've developed over the last 15 years to be able to help us understand that process.
And that was done with both children, correct?
Yes, correct.
Okay. And are conclusions made or opinions made as a result of this psychosocial interview?
Yes, they're a very critical component of the entire assessment, and it fits in to be able to identify what the child has been doing as a way to cope with what has happened to them.
And what were the conclusions as a result of this psychosocial interview with Gabby?
It became very evident that what Gabby had done was internalize the traumatic stress that she had experienced continually. And I'll just kind of narrate that for a second if I can. One of the things that was very clear was her experience of terror in her home because she never knew what was going to happen. And so she had become the caretaker and, quote, parent for Matthew. And so her number one responsibility was to make sure Matthew was safe. And so there were innumerable times when she felt he potentially could be in danger. She described many times standing at the bottom of the steps when the mother would call Maddie upstairs and not knowing if he was going to come down alive or hurt. And she said there were periods of time when she didn't breathe, literally because of that terror. So it became clear that she was living in a constant terror, which then affected her ability to function in a way that was healthy. But what she did do is she internalized all her stress so that she did not demonstrate behaviors that were challenging. Just the opposite. She placated the mother as a way to try and keep keep Matthew safe and herself. Her brain, in a normal process, when somebody's continually exposed to traumatic stress, dissociates. So she described it, I just became numb. I couldn't feel anything. And in that numbness, there is a self-protection because it is too scary to be in her body. And so she dissociated continually.
When you say dissociated from what?
Dissociated from reality. Basically, in dissociation, your brain separates from your body, and you're watching your body. It's a self-protective mechanism that the brain does when it is under extreme stress or terror in order to be able to survive. And so she did this continually in this process. She also felt responsible for the death of her siblings, saying that I should have protected them and continued to live with this after their deaths, and feel responsible that she had not protected them. And then had this overwhelming sense of guilt, remorse, and also, as she described herself, this perpetual anger inside of her that she controlled and was always very fearful that this was going to explode, and if it did, she was so aware of what it might incur, meaning harm to her, or most importantly for her, was harm to Maddie. So she lived in this constant threat, this constant terror, and the brain developed coping strategies, and she at points said, I felt like I was going crazy or that I am crazy. And part of our assessment and part of that interaction was to help her to understand that she wasn't going crazy, but rather that she had been traumatized, that what had happened to her had then caused her reactions that made her feel so different, so numb, and so responsible for everything that happened. The last part of this is that at times she would have intrusive thoughts, meaning thoughts that would come in of fragments of the past maltreatment, physical, both to herself in terms of being burned and hit, as well as the death of her siblings, and she employed what's called avoidance. So when they happened, she would try to just distract herself so as to not be able to think them and to be overwhelmed, which is a very common reaction, so that these would come back to her periodically, and her coping mechanism was that avoidance.
And did she explain how she would distract or engage in avoidance?
Just in terms of reading was the primary way. She would try to read, and as she said to me, reading was a way for me to escape my world. And I think it's very significant that she was a continuous reader, because that was that distraction and that escape. Recently, she said in an interview that we had that she's been surprised because she hasn't read nearly as much anymore. And so it's not that she's not reading, but not in a way to distract herself. And I thought that was a significant statement given what she had done to survive in the environment within her home.
And when you say recently she's told you she hasn't been reading as much, when was the last time you saw her? We saw her on 7/9 when we did the observations with the parents, the fathers, I should say, and I saw her last night. And what was the purpose in seeing her last night?
Purpose was there had been a subpoena, and the purpose was to kind of help her understand what it would be to testify in court today. And so what is often done and very helpful for children is to kind of give them some predictability if they testify what's going to happen. And so it was to give an overview of the court process to her.
In your evaluation of both children, you prepared a report after your evaluation was completed, correct?
That's correct.
And part of this report, it goes through the steps that you've already described, the testing in each test that was done, correct?
Yes.
And what the results of those tests were for each child,
Yes.
correct? This report also discusses your psychosocial interview, correct?
Yes.
After the psychosocial interview portion of your report, however, there's a trauma exposure and system measure portion. Is that correct?
Yes.
What is that?
That's a checklist that our trauma center has developed that's being used across Michigan and other places in the country that looks at potential trauma exposures that the child may have experienced. Gabby has what's called complex trauma, and complex trauma is a phenomena where you're continuously exposed to multiple potential traumatic events within your family. And so this checklist is a way to understand how many potential different types of events could have occurred, and then behaviors, mood, school functioning, and relationally how that may be manifested. It's not a clinical tool, it's a screen to kind of understand the connections between potential traumatic events and behaviors and mood.
In terms of Gabby's coping mechanisms with the trauma in her life, you talked about avoidance. Is that a coping mechanism? Or
Yes.
Is that something?
Yes.
Okay. Was there also, your report discusses her role with her brother.
Yes.
Was that also a coping mechanism for her? Or how would you describe her role with her brother?
Gabby was clearly Matthew's parent. From the time he was born, she described changing his diapers, getting him at night, feeding him, and so she served as the primary parent for Matthew. And that bond, that relational bond, provided Gabby with a sense of importance and meaning to survive. So in a sense, his needs became more important than hers, and that's what really helped her to continue to go forward, because of the relationship that she established from birth, I believe, with Maddie. And so that was a survival, that was a coping, and yet that was also a resiliency factor, because it gave her a connection to her brother that was vital for her to continue to function.
And we haven't gotten into Maddie or Matthew's assessment yet, but you said that this connection was vital to Gabby, you evaluated Maddie also. Do you
Yes.
view this connection as being vital to him also?
Absolutely. We have to realize that both children lived in terror, and when terror occurs, it strengthens a bond between people who are trying to survive. That's kind of known as the Stockholm syndrome. It's known as other things, but in that connection, that this bond develops so strongly because it's not normal everyday stress. It is terror, and terror makes an emotional connection that now both of them in their survival need each other.
Need each other in what way?
Need each other to survive, right? That they became necessary as one, two coming together. Maddie's dependence on Gabby is extreme, that he sees her as keeping her alive, and so
Keeping her alive or him
keeping
alive?
keeping him alive, and so that dependence that he has is what's been able to help him manage his own trauma.
In terms of the initial assessment that was done with Gabby, was there any information gleaned from either the aunt or from Gabby herself regarding Gabby's father, Alexander Dorsey?
There was some. It was minimal in the sense that there was minimal contact. There was a kind of a dad-father being in and out, and as Maddie said, there were as Gabby said, there were times when the mother would have Gabby call her father to bring food to the house, that they didn't have any. And so that contact was very sporadic and periodic, basically very limited as she described it.
In this report, which, Your Honor, I would just indicate for the record that there are 5 reports that were generated by Dr. Henry. One, an initial assessment that was done with Gabby, an initial assessment that was done with Matthew. There are also 3 reports, one pertaining to Mitchelle Blair, Alexander Dorsey, and Stephen Berry, that those have been supplied to the court, and the attorneys have been supplied their respective client's report along with the file that pertains to the respective client. Those reports, obviously Mitchelle Blair's attorney was supplied both children's assessments or evaluations. I'd ask the court to take judicial notice of those reports at this time. They've never been admitted formally, so I move for their admission and the court to take judicial notice of those reports.
And Mr. Giancotti has all 5
Yes.
reports?
Yes.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, so starting with you, Mr. Giancotti, any objections?
None.
Mr. Devlin?
No, Your Honor.
Ms. Anderson?
No.
And Mrs. Burns?
None, Your Honor.
Okay, so all 5 reports will be admitted, but we need to have them marked accordingly, Ms. Megacy. So let's go off the record for a moment. We'll take a brief recess. You can just remain there, Dr. Henry, for just a second while we mark these. You have copies, you have signed copies, Ms. Megacy. We can
Judge, my copies, I do have signed copies. My copies have the highlights on them at this point.
Just do mine. We'll use mine. So do you have any preferences to the order?
I would just, no. However the court has it in front of it, it's fine by me.
Let's do them in that order. It'll be 1 through 5. Well, no,
Actually,
they're not.
2 through 6.
Well, we should start off where we left off, which would be, we may have to remark Dr. Henry's, you know, where we left off. I have to figure it out. We don't have to start with the others. Where we left off last time.
Thank you so much.
Okay, all right, then we'll do 2 through 6, that's fine. back in the record, so the reports are marked as follows. They're all from the Southwest Michigan Children's Trauma Assessment Center, and exhibit number 2 is the trauma assessment report for Gabrielle Blair. Exhibit number 3 is the trauma assessment report for Matthew Berry. Number 4 is the parent assessment report for the mother, Mitchelle Blair. Number 5 is the parent assessment report for Father Alexander Dorsey. And number 6 is the trauma assessment report for Stephen Berry.
To Your Honor. In terms of now DHHS exhibit number 2, which is Gabby's evaluation or assessment, in your report you have a section labeled recommendations. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And the recommendations with respect to Gabby after this evaluation, there's actually 11 different recommendations. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Can you summarize what those recommendations were after your initial evaluation assessment of Gabby?
Yes, generally, A, that Gabby should remain at the great aunt's home. 2 is that...
Well, let me stop you there. When you say that Gabby should remain at the great aunt's home, is that correct?
Yes.
Why is that your recommendation, or was that your recommendation at that point?
A, she felt very safe there. B, Angela, the great aunt, was very committed to her well-being. And C, she needs stability, permanency, and safety in order to be able to heal and recover. And it was clear just in the time that Gabby had spent at Angela's that she was receiving that from her aunt and her uncle.
The uncle being the person who was married to Angela. is that
Yes.
correct? So that was the first recommendation. What was the second recommendation?
The second was treatment for Gabby, trauma treatment, that it is absolutely essential that she have trauma treatment and receive the support necessary to process her experiences in order to be able to recover and to move forward in her life and to be successful.
The third recommendation?
The third was termination of the father's rights. Information from Gabby from the case file that we had gotten from the Department of Human Services, information from Angela, who had some history of the family, and most importantly, Gabby's own understanding. Her own report indicated minimal to no contact or for periods of time. And so that was the other primary recommendation. There are other recommendations that are very specific to needs, but those 3 are the primary driving forces that should happen at this point.
And in terms of the recommendation of termination of parental rights, you addressed a recommendation concerning both Mitchelle Blair and Stephen Berry's rights. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And was that recommendation termination of both of their rights?
Yes.
And why is that?
Your Honor, I would object. I believe that the line of questioning has been regarding Mr. Dorsey at this point, unless counsel switched to Mr. Berry.
I'm sorry, Mr. Berry. I'm sorry, Mr. Dorsey.
Okay,
Correct. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Anderson. In terms of Gabby, thank you.
Yes.
Her father being Alexander Dorsey and mother being Mitchelle Blair, your recommendation was termination of both of their rights. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And why did you have that recommendation?
A is that obviously Gabby had experienced significant abuse herself by the living with her mother and from her mother, which certainly would make that abuse her unfit to live and to terminate parental rights. So that would be A for mom. B for dad, that I, in giving that history and understanding that the father had neglected his duty to his daughter and his daughter who had been killed, and that therefore this potentially could have been avoided had he taken an active role in the care and well-being of his children. And I felt that given the length of time and the only periodic contact, which was minimal, that termination was appropriate.
You also, part of your recommendations included that Gabby remain with Matty. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
And is that for the reasons you've already stated on the record?
Yes.
In terms of Gabby and therapy and making progress based upon what's happened in the past to her, do you have an opinion regarding the type of figure she needs in her life in terms of an adult or a parental figure?
Yes, she needs someone, as I said earlier, that is stable, secure, supportive, provides predictability. So those are essential for her in terms of her development and her ability to recover. And with that kind of support and with that kind of therapeutic support to process the trauma, then I strongly believe that her trajectory is very positive and is certainly in her best interest to remain there.
And do you have an opinion as to where it is in Gabby's best interest to remain?
At Angela's home, her great aunts.
Staying with Gabby now, moving on to her mother and father, Mitchelle Blair. You conducted assessments or evaluations of both parents, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And who did you speak with first?
I spoke with her father, Alexander Dorsey.
But you spoke with or interviewed both parents on the same day, is that correct?
That is correct.
And what day was that?
That was July 9th, 2015.
Where did you speak to Mr. Dorsey at?
At Kids Talk on Southgate, in Southgate.
And can you explain what the process was in terms of your assessment of Mr. Dorsey?
Yes. Initially, we sat down with Gabby and just asked her questions about her father to kind of understand what she was feeling at the moment, what she was feeling about her dad. There had been some concern because she hadn't seen her dad in at least a month, I think, give or take a week, and so that she had not been visiting her dad because she didn't want to see him. And so...
Let me stop you there. Was that confirmed by Gabby that
yes.
his visits had stopped because she did not desire to see him?
Yes.
She was present for this evaluation on the 9th?
Yes.
Did Gabby explain to you on the 9th why she had not wanted to see her father?
Yes.
What was her reasoning?
Her reasoning was that the girlfriend of Mr. Dorsey had testified at a hearing, and Gabby had read it online, that there were times that Mr. Dorsey would bring food and diapers and other supplies to the home for the children when she was living with her mother. And Gabby was very upset, stating that diapers had never been provided to her or her family, that yes, Mr. Dorsey had brought food on occasion, but had never brought those diapers to the family. So she was very angry, and so had been refusing to see Mr. Dorsey.
So this evaluation with respect to Mr. Dorsey, do you speak with Gabby first, or do you speak with Mr. Dorsey first on the 9th?
On the 9th, I spoke with Gabby first.
And the information you gleaned from Gabby was what?
Just as I shared, as well as I asked her if she'd be willing to do the visit, because she hadn't, and she had resisted, and she said yes. And I said, would you like us in the room, meaning myself and or my colleague Amy, in the room with her, or we could do a video stream where she could go in a room with her dad and I could watch it in another room. And she requested that we sit in the room during that visit, which we did.
Who's we?
Myself and at times Amy. I was in there the whole time. Mrs. Barricone was in there on and off because she had something else she was doing.
So per Gabby's request, she would only do the visit with her father if you were present?
Yes.
Did she explain why?
Just because she was so angry, she was uncomfortable, and that is why.
Prior to going into this room with Gabby and her father, did you speak to Mr. Dorsey?
Yes.
Did you explain to him what your purpose in being there was?
Yes.
What did you explain to him?
I explained that we were going to A, observe him with Gabby, and B, that I was going to interview him after the interview to talk about his perceptions of his history with Gabby and the family. And we would do that after we did what's called the MIM. It's called the Marshak Inventory Method, which is a series of activities, I believe 4 or 5 of them, where you give the parent an activity to do with the child. And so I explained those, I gave those to him. He had those in his hand prior to entering the room with Gabby.
The visit with the father, with Mr. Dorsey and Gabby, how long was that visit supposed to be?
There was no time frame. We hadn't defined it in terms of a time frame as to an hour, or I had not put a time limit on that.
Was the your observation of the interaction between the two, however, minimized or lessened as a result of anything?
I'm not sure your question, ma'am.
Was it appears in your reports that the interaction was not an hour but 45 minutes. Is that correct?
Yes.
Was there a reason for that?
Well, basically the interaction, if I could just explain that, that would get to the answer to your question. Is that okay?
Sure.
All right. So the interaction was very uncomfortable in the sense that Mr. Dorsey was very quiet. He did engage in eye contact with Gabby. Gabby had minimal eye contact with him. She obviously was very nervous, and so there was a lot of small talk going back and forth. And so that was very evident of her anxiety. And so what happened is that I was waiting for Mr. Dorsey to lead the activities that he had. And so I had told Gabby that there were activities. I did show her the activities, but I told her that he was going to do some activities with her prior to this interaction happening. And so what happened at that point is Gabby basically said, "Let me see the activities." And so he showed her the activities, and she led the activities. In other words, she said the first one was basically, "Tell me a time when you were young," a story about when you were young, meaning when Gabby was young. And so Gabby took that and started telling a story about when she was young to kind of engage Mr. Dorsey in the process.
Okay, so this is part of the Marsha, is that what is that what you described?
Yeah.
There were 5 different activities?
Yes.
One of them was telling a story about when you were younger?
Yes.
Or the father telling a story, in this case Mr. Dorsey, about when Gabby was younger,
Yes.
is that correct?
Correct.
And you explained to him that that was something you wanted him to do?
Yes.
And was he able to do that?
No, that was led by Gabby.
What were some of the other activities?
I can list them. They're here in the report if I could just take a peek.
Would that refresh your memory?
Yes.
Then please do so.
So, just play a familiar game with the child, teach the child something the child does not know, and thumb wrestling. And those activities are to look at 4 components of parenting engagement, nurturing, structure, and challenge. And so those activities help produce those interactions that look at those 4 components.
Did Mr. Dorsey himself initiate any of these activities?
I do not believe he initiated any. I could be wrong. He may have initiated one of them.
Is that concerning to you?
Yes, I think that and it describes in the report as Mr. Dorsey being passive. He certainly, like I said, had eye contact, would respond to her statements, but it was clear that in that relationship that it was Gabby who was leading the conversation and directing the interaction.
And what does that tell you
Well,
in terms of Mr. Dorsey and his ability as parent, if anything?
it certainly says that Mr. Dorsey would be much more of a passive parent, which was confirmed by his own indication in interaction with me when he talked about that he had a kind of a backseat role in relation to the children, and at one point defined himself as non-confrontational, meaning that he doesn't like confrontation, and so that was one of the reasons why he didn't pursue finding out what had happened to his daughter, Stoney, because he didn't want to confront the mom because of her anger and her outbursts. And so it was clear that in the relationship that I saw, in just that interaction, that Gabby went to her norm of being the parent and leading and directing, and she did that, and he responded to her in a way that was certainly not rude, not disrespectful, responsive, but not an expectation of what you would want in your parent to respond to the needs of your child who had been so traumatized.
Did there appear to be any type of bond between Gabby and her father during this interaction?
Prior to the observation in my interview with Gabby, she indicated that she views her father just as another human being, that she does not feel close to him. She does not feel, quote, love for him in the sense of father to daughter or daughter to father, but rather that he was another person in her life, but not someone that she had a relationship with.
Did Gabby indicate whether she wanted to have a relationship with him in the future?
She indicated at this point she was not interested in that, that she did not want that relationship at the current time.
How did the portion of this assessment where the two were interacting, Gabby and her father, how was it that that ended?
I ended the interaction. I thought that the activities had been performed. There was some kind of prolonged silences where you could see they weren't sure what to talk about. And given Gabby's history of not having seen her dad in a month, having anxiety already, that I felt it was in Gabby's best interest to stop the visit, because I did not see an interaction that was engaging or nurturing that was going to be beneficial to her.
And this was after how long?
This is about approximately 40 minutes. Your Honor, would you be all right if we shut that door? It's very difficult for me to... Thank you.
Was it, in terms of this, we said approximately 40-minute interaction? Did I get that time right?
Yes.
Okay. Did you speak to Gabby or Mr. Alexander about prior visits and how they were in relation to this current visit on the 9th?
As I understood it, after the visit, I spoke with Mr. Dorsey and interviewed him, and I also spoke with Gabby, and both of them indicated that this was a typical visit that they had had since she was placed in her aunt's custody.
So after this session of watching the two interact and performing these Marshak activities, you then spoke with Mr. Dorsey?
Yes.
Okay. And what did you speak to Mr. Dorsey about?
I spoke to Mr. Dorsey about how he understood Gabby, what he thought the impact could have been to her from what she experienced. I spoke to him specifically about what he was experiencing himself, given the information that he had learned and his interactions with Gabby. I spoke to him about what he hoped for Gabby in the future. I spoke to him about a little bit about his childhood. He defined as being fine and okay. And I spoke to him about his recollection of frequency of contact with Gabby during the time when Gabby was living in the house.
In terms of the conversation, the part of the conversation that dealt with how Mr. Dorsey understood Gabby and the impact of past events on her, what were his statements, if any?
He recognized the tremendous sadness, and he called it numbing, that he was experiencing himself, given everything that happened. I thought he was very honest about that and feeling overwhelmed. He indicated that he couldn't imagine kind of what might be happening for Gabby at this point, other than he knew what he was experiencing, and being overwhelmed, and really couldn't define, although he certainly could compare it to something of what he was going through.
So he indicated that he himself was overwhelmed at this point.
Yes.
Did he elaborate as to what that meant, or?
Basically, the death of his daughter, Stoney, the harm that had come to Gabby, the, quote, media coverage that felt like he couldn't get out of his house, that people always were asking about it, and that he just basically was disengaging and shutting down because it was too overwhelming.
In terms of the Gabby and the impact past events have had on her, did you speak to him or question him as to why he was sporadic in terms of his involvement in her life?
He basically gave me kind of a continuum of answer in terms of one, as I said earlier, when talking about not questioning about what was happening to Stoney and to find out about her. He indicated that he, again, was non-confrontational and didn't want to upset the mother, all right? And the second part of that, in terms of his periodic contact with Gabby, he did not go into that at any length in terms of the reasons, other than he would see her somewhat regularly for a time and then irregularly for a time.
In terms of not wanting to be confrontational, however, did Mr. Dorsey make any statements regarding whether he knew Mitchelle Blair to be a violent or aggressive person in the past?
Yes, he did.
What did he say?
He said that she could be violent and aggressive.
Was that the reason he did not want to confront her?
That's what he communicated to me.
In your report, which has been admitted now as DHHS Exhibit Number 5, you also indicate during your interview with Mr. Dorsey that he described Ms. Blair as being unpredictable. Is that correct?
Yes.
Part of your report, after your interview with Mr. Dorsey, it contains a summary of the MIM observation. Is that correct?
Yes.
That's the Marshak.
Yes.
Is that what you were talking about?
Yes.
The summary, if you could explain to us what your summary of the observation was.
Well, basically that there was minimal engagement between the two, that father, as I said, had been passive, that there was not a nurturing relational interaction. Certainly there had not been a structure to it other than what Gabby had defined, and so I was very concerned about the interactions as far as seeing engagement, nurturing, and structure.
In fact, in your report on page 5, you stated that Father Dorothy lacks the skills necessary to provide the structure and appropriate challenges necessary for her continued growth. Is that correct?
That's correct.
In terms of your report, this conclusion or summary of the MIM observation, following that is a section that's entitled Impressions. Is that correct?
That's correct.
What is this section?
This is taking all the information that I had available and framing conclusions in terms of what I saw, what I think would be in Gabby's best interest. And so I wanted to frame the information to draw those conclusions.
And in that section, under Impressions, you indicate that the observations between Gabby and her father was consistent with the history of an absent parent who lacked an understanding of his daughter's needs and strengths. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then you follow through this as you did with the assessment portion, or in the assessment of Gabby, her report, you follow through with this, with a recommendation. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and that recommendation does once again deal with the termination of parental rights. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that concerning Mr. Dorsey's rights and Gabby. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And in that conclusion, did you have a recommendation regarding whether Gabby's rights, her father's right to sue her should be terminated.
Yes.
And what was that recommendation? What did you state?
I stated that because Gabby was 18 years old, that I did not see the potential value or even the legal ability to terminate, all right?
Is it fair to say you did not know that right could still be terminated once Gabby achieved the age of 18?
Yes, I did not know that.
Knowing that Mr. Dorsey's rights and Mitchelle Blair's rights to Gabby can be terminated even though she's now a legal adult, do you believe that termination is in her best interest?
Yes.
And why is that?
Because at this point, there's a long history of what I would define as parental neglect of Gabby, and that she needs to be in a permanent, stable environment, as I said earlier. And so it is in her best interest that she remain with the aunt, and that if she was to be moved, it would be, I think, extremely traumatic to be placed with her father, given her relationship with him, and certainly her anxiety and anger, given that relationship has never been a parent-child relationship.
I want to move on to Matthew, and we'll come back to Mitchelle Blair collectively with both children, okay? Moving on to Matthew's assessment, again, that was done in April, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
April the 8th.
April 8th, 2015, and that was with you and Ms. Paracone, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, was that also done at Kids Talk?
Yes.
And that his assessment was composed again of the testing?
Yes.
Correct? And then the psychosocial interview?
Yes.
And then getting a history from the aunt?
Yes.
Is that accurate?
Yes.
In terms of the testing and Matthew, were there any results that were concerning to you?
Yes.
What were the results?
There were many results that were concerning.
Please explain.
And as I described, the brief intelligence test that we had given to Gabby Matthews, he scored a verbal of 58, which is in the 0.3 percentile, means that 99.7% of all kids his age have a higher verbal IQ at that point than he did, all right? Which is basically would be defined in terms of developmentally disabled at that point, and would receive cognitive impairment classification in the school system. His nonverbal was 74, which was at the 4th percentile, meaning 96% of kids his age would have a higher nonverbal capacity, that ability to integrate information as far as conceptually without language. So those were very concerning at that point in time. And then in the self, which is the language, the passing criteria was 17 score. He only had an 8, which was well below criterion and indicated significant language deficits. The barrier, or the VMI, was more positive. That was in the 34th percentile, indicating that he was able to take something he sees and to transmit it into the paper. All right.
Let's just pause for 1 second, Dr. Henry. See if the mother is apparently they're interrupting the mother for a moment.
Okay, I was just wondering, they want to know the status of it, so you're good.
Ms. Blair, are you able to continue?
Yes.
All right, let's go back anyway. Ms. Meigs?
The last test, that, just so we're clear, that you said 34th percentile,
Right.
with respect to what result?
The VMI, which was the visual motor, so that was much more within the normal range. But the first two were very concerning.
You had information that Matthew had not been in school, is that
That's correct.
In terms of those results and the percentages and cognitive impairment, did you have an opinion regarding whether Matthew his percentiles could increase?
It was our expectation that they would increase if he was environmentally and developmentally stimulated, and so that was our hope. 54 is extremely low, and so definitely was hoping that given that kind of safety, because again, we can't learn if we're not safe. Matthew has what's called hypervigilance. He's constantly scanning his environment for danger, and so that interrupts the brain's upper, quote, prefrontal cortex ability to learn, because he's in this bottom part of his brain that's so aware of potential danger. So our hope was that as he felt safe and could begin to relax, then you can access your higher thinking. And that was the hope, given that he could access it with developmental stimulation.
In terms of Matthew or Maddie's ability to feel safe and relaxed, you've already testified about his relationship briefly with Gabby. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Do you believe that Gabby is a component in his ability to feel safe and relaxed?
She's the essence of whatever safety he has had in the past. And so she's linked, connected to his brain to say when she's there, he gives her safety. And when I say safety, given what he had experienced previously in his home with his mother and the fear and the terror that was there, that is a safety that wasn't able to provide the necessary security, but it was enough safety in order for him to survive. And so she is inextricably linked to his safety.
In terms of the, is that a summary of the test and the results that were conducted with Matthew?
Yes.
Okay. Moving on then to the psychosocial interview portion of this assessment, can you explain what the conclusions and or observations were with Maddie?
Yes. Maddie has learned, he has a very charming smile. He has a radiant smile that is kind of plastered on his face, and we know from kids who've been traumatized that they often learn to smile as a way to keep safe, and he has this what we call superficial charm. And so he takes this wherever he goes. He walked into the assessment with this huge smile. He kept that smile. In the psychosocial interview, when we began to probe, and obviously that probing is different for his age versus as it was with Gabby, and so we did a lot of kind of play work and asking some questions and drawing on the board to kind of help him communicate. What was clear is that he's very much into avoidance, and avoidance is very consistent with his diagnosis that we gave of PTSD, that he's overwhelmed by his memories, and he has fragmented memories, as I talked about with Gabby, that they're little pieces, but they don't all make a whole, meaning a whole organized story that with which to understand what's happened to him. And so he becomes very active, which is the other part of his trauma, what we would call that hypervigilance or hyperarousal. He's a great bouncer in the sense of going from one thing to another tangentially, because he's always in this very much on the edge of fight-flight because of his experiences and how his brain has become wired. So, and he also, when he talked about, that some bad things happened, my mom went to jail, I was scared, I can't talk about them, and kind of stopped at that point, and we did not push him, certainly didn't want to exacerbate that stress that he was already experiencing, but it was clear, and part of that assessment with younger kids is you're looking at the themes that come in the interaction, and certainly those themes of hypervigilance, hyperarousal, and avoidance, and fragmentation of memory were all there.
Given these conclusions regarding Maddie, do you have an opinion regarding the type of parental figure he needs in his life?
Well, since he is so young, his brain is not fully developed, and so he is at a crossroad, and I can't underline this enough, he's at a crossroad in his development, given that his development has significantly suffered cognitively because of living in this lower part of his brain, and so what he needs is predictability, ongoing security. He needs to hear and know that he's loved and cared for. He needs consistency so that his world becomes safer when he knows day to day what's going to happen. And so all those are essential for him. He needs, at this point, continued, I believe, contact on a day-to-day basis with his sister as he transitions from her to the caregiver in terms of who is parenting him, because obviously Gabby in the future will leave and can't remain there until he's 18. So there's a transitional time where her kind of passing along that parenting to the caregiver, in this case it's the aunt, is essential to help him build that safety. I think the relationship with his uncle has been very important to him in terms of that male relationship that he had not experienced on a day-to-day basis. I think it's very important for him, and so all of that together hopefully provides that safety and helps him to begin to learn and to be able to navigate his fears in a way that doesn't disrupt his behavior, because he is at risk of that behavior deteriorating.
After you're conducting your assessment of Maddie in April, you then again in July spoke to Maddie's mother, Mitchelle Blair, correct?
Yes.
And father, Stephen Barry, correct?
I had not spoken to the mother until the 9th.
Thank you, until
Yes.
July 9th,
Yes.
correct? Okay, and was July 9th the first time you spoke with the father, Stephen Barry?
Yes.
And did that also occur at the Southfield Kids Talk
Yes.
office? Did you conduct the same type of assessment you did with Alexander Dorsey?
I did.
Did you observe, speak to Maddie before observing him interact with his father?
Briefly, very briefly. Not like I did not sit down with him and interview him. I was just more, we're going to sit with your dad, and he's coming in, and he was comfortable with having the being alone in the room with his dad and having the video streamed into the other room while I watched that.
Did you speak to strike that. Did you do the marsh shock activities as you did with Alexander Dorsey?
Yes.
Were those activities explained to Mr. Barry?
Yes.
Did you explain to Mr. Barry that you would be observing his interaction with his son via video?
Yes.
And after that was explained, did you in fact observe the interaction between Mr. Barry and Maddie?
Yes.
Can you explain to us what observations you made?
Well, there were several. One is that initially the father, Mr. Barry, gave Maddie a bear hug when he came in. Maddie came in with his smile, as he does. And so there was a time that I gave them to converse and re-engage before doing the marsh shock. And so that conversation began, and Matthew began to talk about a movie and a toy, and Mr. Barry was responding to that, saying, you know, he hadn't gotten the movie, but he was going to go look for it, and talked about a particular toy, an Avenger figure that he wanted, and so Mr. Barry said, I'll look for that, and so they were engaged reciprocally. They certainly, Matthew did not demonstrate any fear. It's hard to exactly know with Maddie how much anxiety he's experiencing, because unlike Gabby, who you can see the anxiety in her, it's more difficult because he has that smile. But he did engage, and they engaged, and then they went into the activities. Mr. Barry did lead those activities. He was engaging with him. He did engage and attempted to engage. So that was a positive. He did communicate a very positive story about, tell me a time when you were born, about when you were born, or about the child when he was born anyways. And he said, you know, you were born and it was the greatest day of my life. And so that was a very positive statement that I heard. What I saw as it continued was more of the same. There was an engagement process that occurred. I did not see a nurturing process. I did hear that statement about the best day was when you were born. That was a nurturing, but in the interaction, it was much more of a just kind of a talking and not a physical touch and or engaging in the sense of a nurture emotional piece. All right? I did not see that. I did definitely see willingness to converse and engage. There was some structure. He did praise Maddie once. He built a block structure, I believe it was about the block structure, and he said, good job. So he had some skills in being able to give praise and to engage. I was concerned about the nurturing as well as the structure. And he did build a structure, a block structure, and kind of challenged Maddie to build that. And so that was in the okay range, all right? So.
When you say, I want to explore that a little further, when you say the okay range in terms of structure, what are you looking for as the person conducting this evaluation, observing the interaction between the two? What are you looking for in terms of the nurturing and structure aspect?
Well, what I'm looking for in structure is to be able to say, how do we bring Maddie and provide some boundaries for him, all right, so that, you know, oftentimes kids can, without that structure, they can just kind of do their own thing and be very kind of in control of the engagement. And so that's what can happen, and so you're looking for the person, the parent in this case, to take more of a control and kind of structure this, but be flexible, so it's a balance. You don't want to frustrate the child, but you want to direct the child. So that's what we look in structure, and I thought that that wasn't there, certainly as the engagement was. In the nurturing, it's the emotional connection. It's the emotional presence of smiling, of touching, of feeling, of communicating of feelings, of happy and sad, and so those are the things that you look for in the nurturing.
And after this interaction that you observed, you conducted an interview with Mr. Berry, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And what were your conclusions or observations of Mr. Berry during this interview?
I was very concerned about a number of things that I identified in the report. One was, and certainly people come in with distrust of a clinician, and I certainly respect that. I began to ask some very probing questions about his childhood and its impact on him, and initially he was quite minimized, said it was fine, and I asked more, and then his intensity level increased in the sense of what I defined as somewhat contentious. All right, why do you have to ask me these questions? And I said, it's to help me understand you as a parent to your son, and he agreed to continue, to allow me to continue those questions, but so it was very clear that there was some defensiveness, there was some concern, and he did communicate eventually some significant experiences that he had had as a child with his mom that were very emotionally difficult for him, and without going into the details of those, just said that this had occurred and he had learned not to let emotions drive his behavior because that could lead to great difficulty. And so that's one of the things that he took away from that childhood. Two things that he said about the kids that concerned me. One was the fact that he said that he was around when Matthew was 2 or 3 in that area, and that when I talked about structure and discipline, he said that Matthew knows now, because when he was 2 or 3, he understood how and what I needed from him in terms of how to behave, and so he knows that now, right? He knows at 8 or 9, he knows that this is what he can do and not do with me based upon when he was around the house when Matthew was 2 and 3.
Okay, and why is that? You said that was concerning or of concern. Why is that?
Well, because of the fact that a child at 2 or 3 does not remember nor with a significant length of time of 5 to 6 years of a lack of parenting in terms of a day-to-day parenting, that he's going to remember what he can and can't do with his father is really inaccurate. I mean, I can only say it's incorrect because that's not. Now, if he learned fear from his father, he certainly could have that, and I don't know that, and I'm not saying that, but that could stay at 2 or 3. But as far as what were the do's and don'ts of discipline, a child could not in any way recall that. The other thing he said that was concerning was when we talked about the role of Gabby, and initially he communicated something that, Gabby's parenting has been parenting to a degree Matthew, and then he said, well, no, really it's more like a big sister role, that she really wasn't his parent, that she was more like a big sister. And so I said, I challenged that. I said, what I see is that clearly she was the parent. And he said, so I said something to the effect of, that would be really difficult if he was not with Gabby because that she has been his parent. And he said that she could come visit him if Matthew was placed in her custody, or she could come live with them, all right, if that was not possible. And so I was just very concerned about him understanding the full impact of the relationship and what it was between Gabby and Maddie.
Do you believe he got that full understanding or comprehended that
No.
relationship?
No.
Do you believe that comprehension of their relationship is vital in terms of Maddie's progress?
Yes.
Did you speak to Mr. Berry about his current living situation and plans if Maddie's return to him?
Yes, I did.
What did he say?
So I asked him specifically about his living arrangement. He said he was living with somebody, and I said, has this person had any contact with Maddie? And would there be any preliminary visit contact? Because we know that when children are placed with a parent who has a significant other, that significant other plays a huge role in what happens in the relationship and the development of the child. And so he said no, that she had not, and then said, well, I'm only planning to be here temporarily. I'm planning soon to get my own place, and so she wouldn't be a part of it. So that's how he concluded that from initially the statement that he was living with someone.
Did he indicate when he was moving or where he was moving to?
No, he did not.
In terms of a job, did you speak to him or did he indicate what his plans were in terms of income?
Yes, he had indicated that he had just been to Manpower and that he could start a job within the next week or so as soon as he got his Social Security number. For some reason, and I can't remember, that he had said, I don't have it, and they won't let me start the job without the Social Security number.
Had you also talked to Gabby about Mr. Berry's involvement or role in their family?
Yes.
And what insight did Gabby give you, if any?
Gabby indicated that Mr. Berry had not been a parent to Stephen, that he had been around basically only because of the relationship with the mother, Michelle, that she, meaning Gabby, was very concerned and actually said to her mother, you're way too available for Mr. Berry. He comes for a period of time and then he's gone for 7 or 8 months. And every time you keep letting him back in and he eats the food and does whatever and doesn't contribute. And so she was very articulate about his lack of parenting and or continued presence in his life.
And as in the report with Alexander Dorsey, after your interview section, you have an impression portion of the evaluation, correct?
That's correct.
What were your final impressions regarding Stephen Berry and Matthew Berry?
Well, there were several, and so let me just contextualize this. One of the things about a visit, in observing a visit, is parents can be engaging, and it was a positive. Certainly Mr. Berry did engage, but that's a snapshot of a history, and it can be very playful. Certainly one of the things I think is important is that at the end of the visit, Maddie started crying, and when was wondering what that was about. That was unexpected, and then basically he said, I thought I was going to be able to play with your phone today, all right? So that I thought, and I think that that's important to note, all right, that the phone has been a part of those visits in the past, and so that was something important. And I think objects for for Maddie right now are important, and he wanted that, and that's part of his distraction, right, to kind of escape. So I say that in terms of contextualizing the visit against the history, where all the information that I have is that Mr. Berry was periodically within the home, and that those periods of time, especially after Maddie was 2 or 3, he was not parenting or supporting Maddie's care. He was not responding to Maddie's needs, but rather it was much more, the contact was about the relationship with the mother. And so given that history, given what I saw, again, I saw engagement, I did not see nurturing, I saw an exaggerated belief by Mr. Berry that he could parent Maddie, and I saw no evidence in the history of what and how he could do that. I wrote in the report, we oftentimes, when we're evaluating parents' ability to parent versus termination of parental rights, use a model called the trans-theoretical model of change, which looks at people and how they make change. And the first stage of that is, I don't have a problem, and the second stage is, I do, but I don't know how to do anything about it. And then there is getting ready to change, and then there's the change itself, and then the ongoing takes year and a half, 2 years if you really make a commitment to change. I saw that Mr. Berry was in this kind of pre-contemplation, I can just do what I got to do and I can make this happen, versus, yeah, I know Maddie needs something a little more, I have to do something different, but he had no plan in any way, shape, or form for housing, for job, for relationship, and I don't think he understands the significance of the trauma that Maddie has experienced and how that's going to impact him certainly the rest of his life, and hopefully he learns how to manage that, and the necessity of his presence and the intensity of that care in terms of security, safety, and predictability.
And you know that Maddie is placed with his aunt also, is that right? Correct?
Yes.
Okay, and do you believe that to be an appropriate placement for Maddie?
Absolutely.
Beyond appropriate, do you think that's the best placement for Maddie?
Your Honor, I object to the line of questioning. I don't think it's appropriate to compare a placement with a relative to a biological parent. I would say that there's case law to support that it is inappropriate to compare a potential placement with a parent's home, as in Ray Hatcher, 443 Mish 426.
My response is that the court, one of the factors the court has to determine in terms of if a child is placed with a relative, the court has to factor that in terms of best interest. So I believe exploring that, given that the child is placed with a relative, is necessary for a best interest hearing.
Your Honor, may I just respond? The placement with a relative weighs against termination of a parent's rights, and that's the relevance of where the child's placed, not would the child be better off with this relative versus potentially working towards reunification with the father, and I believe that's where the line of questioning is going.
It may be, but under Mason, the placement is relevant as to whether or not termination is in the child's best interest under In re Mason. But in order for the court to consider that in its analysis, the court has to know what the circumstances are surrounding the placement, whether it's working, whether it's likely to be long-term, etc. So the court will allow you some latitude.
What I'm trying to get at is in your report, Doctor, you talk about, at least Mr. Berry's report, you talk about in some respect, Maddie's level of improvement. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, Maddie's level of improvement in what regard?
So when we saw him in July, we did another KBIT, which is the Coffin Brief Intelligence Test, because I wanted to see if potentially there had been some improvement. I was very concerned about the 55, and Maddie doesn't present as a 55. And so in that brief time of 3 months, he had gained 18 points on his IQ test. All right.
That's significant to you?
It is hugely significant. So that was a very significant positive about what I believed was the safety, the security, and the developmental stimulation, which I talked about earlier, that really, again, he's at a crossroad, and every way the system and family can provide support for him is absolutely necessary if he is to recover.
And is it your understanding that his current placement with the aunt, that she wishes to plan permanently for Maddie?
Yes.
In terms of Mr. Berry and his rights, do you believe it's in Maddie's best interest to have his father's rights terminated?
Yes, I do.
Is that for the reasons you stated?
Yes.
Moving on now to Mitchelle Blair. You also conducted an evaluation of Mitchelle Blair, correct?
That's correct.
That occurred at the jail?
That's correct.
Wayne County Jail, correct?
Yes.
And obviously, given that it was at the jail, you could not observe her interact with her children.
That's correct.
So explain to me what her evaluation consisted of, please.
The evaluation consisted of an interview with her, and specifically talking about the children in terms of Maddie and Gabby, her perceptions of them, her perceptions of the fathers in terms of their availability and their parenting of Maddie and Gabby. So those were the primary questions that we asked in terms of getting at an understanding of that history in the home, as well as understanding Maddie and Gabby from her perspective.
Was there, in getting this history from Ms. Blair, was there any information that was given to you that you found relevant in terms of the children's best interest?
Yes, and I have to say that everything that Gabby had communicated to me about what was going on in the house, in terms of the fathers, in terms of the mother's interactions with her, the abuse, with her relationship with Maddie, was confirmed by the mother. It was very consistent that I would say something, or Mom would say something, and I would say, this is what Gabby said, and it just matched. So it really increased Gabby's credibility in terms of, she obviously has not talked to Mother since the removal, and yet their history as they described it were very consistent with one another.
History in terms of what? What match?
With the fathers, with the
what
children.
What specifically about the fathers?
That the fathers were not available, that the fathers were periodic, that Mr. Berry, primary concern was his, I'm going to say relationship, but she would define the coming in and staying at their house, meaning Maddie and the mother and Gabby's house, and that relationship was out of his need of needing a place to stay, or needing money, or needing food, that was the basis of the relationship. And the mother actually brought up, before I had even said anything about Gabby's statement about she was just available to Mr. Berry too easily, she brought that up before I even said that. So, and she talked about Mr. Dorsey in a sense of just not being around, being quite consistent with, as he described himself, as more passive, whereas Mr. Berry was more, as she described, using them and their family to get what he needed.
And in terms of Mitchelle Blair, you, at the time of her evaluation, were you aware that she was, or strike that, are you now aware that she is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so in terms of her rights to her children, do you have an opinion regarding termination of her rights?
Yes, that termination should occur.
With respect to both children?
Yes.
Judge, may I have one moment?
Yes.
Okay, cross, Mr. Giancotti. Do you need a break after? Are you okay?
No, I can keep going.
Hi, Dr. Henry.
Good morning.
I'm the guardian ad litem for the children. I just have a couple of follow-up questions. You had used the word or the term terror, and I'm not sure if you use that in a clinical sense or just a general understanding of what you meant by that word.
So, terror is not a clinical word. Terror is a reality of you're potentially facing death at any moment and not knowing when it might happen, or you're facing extreme harm and you don't know where it's going to happen, and you are powerless to stop that. So terror is the experience of living in that. Trauma is the impact from that terror. Right?
Okay.
So it is not a clinical word, but it is a reality of what I believe both kids experienced.
Okay, so when you had stated both children lived in terror.
Yes.
Is that what you were referring to?
Yes.
And you said is that a trauma?
So terror is the experience of that. Trauma is the impact. Trauma, so that then the memories, the hypervigilance, the dissociation, all of that is because of that, being exposed to that.
Okay. And then, as it relates to Mr. Dorsey and Gabby's relationship, you indicated that you thought that Gabby needed a stable, secure, and a supportive parental figure in her life.
Yes.
And do you believe Mr. Dorsey is able to offer her that at this time?
No.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Hey, Mr. Devlin.
Morning, Dr. Henry. I'm Adam Devlin.
Morning.
I'm the attorney for Mr. Dorsey.
Okay.
So all my questions were related to
Sure.
Mr. Dorsey and Gabrielle. What were your general observations of Alex while you were forming your report?
During, you mean writing the report, or while I was with him?
While you were observing.
I thought, again, as I said, Mr. Dorsey seemed passive. He certainly wanted to be there at the visit. He seemed very uncomfortable in the interaction. Certainly, as I stated, was led by Gabby. So in my interactions with him, I thought he was quite straightforward. He said he wanted the best for Gabby, that he knew she wanted to be a veterinarian. He supported that, that he wanted her to go to college. He supported her staying at the aunt's house. So I thought, certainly outside of, quote, being a parent, he wanted something for the well-being of Gabby.
And in your, I guess, investigation and observations, did you believe that the mother suppressed or interfered with any relationship between Alex and Gabrielle?
Well, from what Mr. Dorsey said to me, he clearly was, I think, afraid or fearful of the mother. And so, right or wrong, I can't determine how much that was, but clearly he stated that he did not want to upset her, and so therefore was non-confrontational. I think just by my sitting with him and interacting with him about what he's experiencing now, my guess would be that that's very accurate in the sense that he tends to be more passive and disengaged and overwhelmed by any kind of significant conflict.
Do you think the terror and heightened anxiety levels in Gabrielle could have limited their relationship?
Say it again, I'm not sure what you mean.
I was asking, the first question was in relation to Mr. Dorsey. So do you think that the heightened terror levels in Gabrielle could have affected her ability to form a relationship with her father?
I think that the heightened terror and the trauma certainly impacted that relationship, absolutely. I think that what potentially could have been there, if he had been available, would have been to reduce the trauma, to help her get through that, which did not happen. But certainly because she was so fearful, she learned to disengage from other relationships, and she said that herself as a survival. But given the potential of what could have happened by an active parent, I think is what I'm really most concerned about.
Now that the mom is incarcerated, do you think that there is a better opportunity for them to have a growing relationship?
I think potentially as time happens, and again, remember that Gabby is healing, that in the future that could happen. It's not going to happen right now, but I think that when she's 20 or 25 or whatever, that certainly could happen. I think that her need will change over time, and she may have that need to connect to him.
Do you believe that Gabby's correctly processing emotions?
I think she's made significant progress.
She's still internalizing.
Yes, she is, and she's going to internalize the rest of her life. All right, that's her primary coping. But we're hoping that she can find those safe places to process rather than just holding it.
Would a reliving of the events surrounding, I guess, the need for these termination proceedings, would that have a deleterious effect on her progress?
Say it again. I'm not sure your question.
Would her having to relive all the issues surrounding the terminations and the reason why we're here, would that have a deleterious effect on the progress she is making?
Yes, I think that one of my concerns is how does the system potentially re-expose her and overwhelm her with stress as she's trying to manage and to heal from the trauma that she's already experienced. And so that is my concern, that she's put in situations that have to occur that don't look at her well-being and the impact of that.
You reported that Gabby wants to make friends and enjoys seeing her cousins. Is that correct?
Yes.
How did you arrive at this conclusion?
Because she told me. She told me. And one of the good things she said about that, which again, you talk about her progress, she said in a look that was very positive and a smile on her face to say, I've actually made 2 friends at school. And so I thought that was very important.
Do you believe these family and emotional connections are important to Gabby?
They're the foundation of everything.
Would Gabby have been able to create normal relationships under the influence of the terror that she was subjected to?
No.
Does the disassociation that you discussed about her, does that affect making friends and forming relationships?
Yes.
Reported that Alex hopes that Gabby will learn to feel comfortable around him and know that he is there for her. Is that correct?
Yes.
How did you arrive at this conclusion?
Because he communicated that to me, and I think just from being with him, I think that was genuine.
Okay, that was going to be my next question.
Yes.
How did that conclusion and the genuineness of that conclusion affect your report?
It shared, as I spoke earlier, I think that the availability of that potential relationship in the future could be important. And so, but that's to be determined by Gabby. And I think that the neglect that she experienced, certainly she has to process his lack of protection, which all kids have to do when the non-offending parent doesn't protect. That's a betrayal, and I think she's not at that place yet, but I think that's going to have to happen, and if that can happen, then maybe in the future that she could be comfortable with the relationship.
Then how did Alex's, I guess, statements or expressions to you that he cannot rush into a relationship with Gabby, how did that affect you?
I think that it is obviously communicated in the report. I think it just, again, communicates that he recognizes and wants what's best for Gabby, and I thought I certainly heard that from him, and I'm sure that he's struggling as to what that's going to look like, and right now it's really under Gabby's control given her age, and so I think that it affected my perception of him in the sense of I really think he does want, but doesn't understand what she's got to go through in order to potentially get there.
But you think that sentiment is genuine?
Yes.
Your report indicated that Alex is supportive of Gabby remaining at her great aunt and great uncle's home. Is that correct?
Yes.
And did he tell you that?
Yes.
Do you think that's genuine?
Yes.
would it be true then to say that Alex recognizes putting Gabby's needs over his own immediate needs?
I can't say that, all right? I cannot say that. I can say that he wants the best for her. I can't say he's willing to put her needs before his. I do not know that. His history would say no, but I think he wants what's best for Gabby.
You mentioned his history. In all of your, I guess, observations and interview with him, did you take into account what you knew about his history? Did you notice a positive trend in his desires and actions towards Gabby?
Since the removal, yes.
Yes.
All right. Prior to that, no.
You reported that he wants to support her, is that correct?
Yes.
And you believe that's genuine?
Yes.
Judge, at this point, I mean, I've let it go on. What essentially asking the witness to do is to make credibility determination. That's for the court to make. He can opine as to whether, or make statements as to what the father told him, and if he had any concerns about the father after, based upon his conversations, but asking him to say, is he telling you the truth or not, is not appropriate.
Well, he can't ask if he's telling Dr. Henry the truth, but certainly Dr. Henry's been qualified as an expert, so Dr. Henry can give his opinion, or I guess his prognosis, on what value, if any, the relationship may have. So to the extent that's what you're asking, you can ask him that.
I'm only asking is whether or not in his clinical opinion that he believes Alex is making a genuine effort with these statements. He's not just using these as words to try to get his own way in this proceeding.
You can answer that. Oh, you can answer that.
So I would say, from my judgment, and this is strictly a judgment, that I would say he does want Gabby to succeed, and he wants to support her however he can, knowing that history and knowing that she has to decide how that's going to be.
You reported that Alex's behavior is consistent with a parent that lacks understanding of his daughter's strengths and needs. Is that correct?
Yes.
But you've also reported that he wants, generally what's best for her, that he's interested in her well-being, and that he's supportive of her decisions. Is that correct?
Yes.
So, would you safe to say that he's trying to arrive at the proper conclusion with regard to Gabby?
Yes.
And you had mentioned in, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the name, the MIM report.
Yes.
Report that he's desirous but lacks the necessary skills. That's correct?
Yes.
Do you believe those skills can be taught?
At this point, no. I don't think with Gabby. I think that's done, given her age, given her need to be able to heal. I do not think that that's going to happen. I think that that might be different with a younger child. I think that could be taught, but the place between Gabby and he is not 5 years old, and so she has different needs than a 5-year-old, and so I don't think those skills can be taught to him at this point.
You concluded that there's potential that his support of her decisions could lead to increased desire to have a relationship. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, say it again?
I said you concluded that there is a potential that his support of her decisions could lead to an increased desire to have a relationship.
Yes.
Why did you conclude that?
Basically, because as I've been describing, I think that there is the potential, if he continues to want to be supportive and available to her, that that could happen.
And prior to your testimony earlier with the Attorney General, you had concluded in your subsequent report, Mr. Dorsey, that you were not in favor of termination, correct?
At that point, I, quote, said, she's 18 years old, didn't even know if you could terminate. I still don't know if you can terminate, all right? But certainly the grounds are there for termination. My decision was based on the fact that she was 18 and didn't think that was possible.
You also testified that there's no potential value of termination?
In terms of if you're looking at it from a legally, I, again, didn't think that that could happen.
If this court were to terminate Mr. Dorsey's relationship for parental rights, do you think that he and Gabby could have a relationship on the other side of that termination?
Yes, absolutely.
Do you think that would no effect?
That as far as if Gabby wanted a relationship with her father, the, quote, legality of that would be nil because of the age of the child. Certainly at 19, 20, if she wants to see her father, it doesn't matter what had happened in terms of legally. She wanted to pursue that, that could happen.
but from a psychological standpoint, would it have an effect?
No, I don't think it would have an effect.
Do you believe that, in your observations of Alex, do you believe that he loves her?
I guess I can't say that. I can say that he really wants to support her and wants the best for her, and so I guess I would leave that to you to decide that.
No further questions, Your Honor.
All right, Ms. Anderson.
What's the possible that all you lawyers will not be successful?
Hold on, Ms.
trying to
Blair.
blame them?
Hold
Keep
on, Ms.
playing the blame game. That's your only focus.
Hold on, Ms. Blair. All right, Ms. Anderson.
Thank you. Dr. Henry, you assessed Matthew on April 8th of this year?
Yes?
And did you fully assess him again on July 9th?
No?
So the tests that you ran were just on April 8th?
Yes, yes.
Okay. And April 8th would have been about 2 weeks from the time that Matthew was removed from his mother's home in that environment, correct?
Don't know exactly the time. I couldn't tell you. I know it was within a month. I do not know this
Were you
exactly.
aware that the mother was arrested on or about March 24th of this year?
I did not know the exact date. No, I did not know that.
Okay, so, but you knew it had been just a 2 to 3 weeks?
Yes, right.
Did you take into account the short amount of time that Matthew had been removed from his mother in that environment in any of the results that you observed or obtained?
Are you talking about the testing results?
Correct.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it doesn't change the results, but in the report it talks about his potential is unknown. And so when we're looking at this, it gives us a kind of a baseline to say, here's what is. And so the hope is, as I had said earlier, that the long-term trajectory will be much more positive.
When you evaluated or assessed Matthew on April 8th, about how long did that take?
That took about 2.5 hours, I would say.
So that was engaging Matthew in various tests and questions for 2.5 hours?
Yes.
And he is 8 years old?
Yes.
Okay.
And it also involves play, so we did lots of things, so it wasn't just testing.
All right, and what time did the evaluation begin, if you recall?
We did Gabby initially and Maddie after that, so I couldn't tell you exactly when. It was probably noonish.
Okay, and to your knowledge, was Matthew in the waiting area while you were working with
Yes.
Gabby?
Yes,
And how long did you work with Gabby?
about 2 hours.
All right, so Matthew had been sitting for a couple of hours,
Mhm.
correct?
He had been out and about with his aunt and uncle. They had been outside. They had done a variety of things.
All right, do you know if Matthew ate anything before the interview?
I believe they went out and got something to eat.
You said part of your assessment included speaking with the current caregiver, a great aunt, Miss Gordon?
Yes.
All right. And did Miss Gordon tell you that as far as Matthew's behavioral and emotional history, that quote, Matthew, well, she said Matthew, did you say that Matthew's great aunt did not have any concerns about Matthew's behavior at this time, and that she felt he was happy and can display a range of emotions?
Yes.
So Ms. Gordon did not, on April 8th, have concerns about Matthew's behaviors at that time, correct?
That's correct.
When you performed the child behavioral checklist, was that also based upon Ms. Gordon's observations?
Yes.
All right, and you found nothing clinically significant regarding the child behavioral checklist, correct?
That's correct. Those are all from the aunts filling those out.
right.
There was nothing clinically significant at all.
With regards to testing Matthew for ADHD in the ADHD system scale, you also found nothing clinically significant?
That's correct.
And again, that was based upon the reporting of Ms. Gordon?
Yes.
When you tested Matthew for visual motor processing, he was in the average range, is that correct?
Yes.
When you also tested him, you indicated that he demonstrated appropriate conversational skills,
Yes.
and that's despite the low verbal IQ?
Yes.
All right. You also noted that his sensory processing was typical performance?
And those are from the aunt as well.
Okay.
She filled out that questionnaire.
All right. And did you also indicate in your report that Matthew was able to identify and express a variety of feelings verbally?
Yes.
When you assessed Matthew for the child dissociative checklist, you found nothing clinically significant, correct?
Yes, correct.
So what does that tell you?
Well, it tells that he's not displaying symptoms according to the aunt who filled this out. I didn't fill that out. The aunt filled that out. Again, that would suggest dissociative.
Did you ask, or someone asked Matthew about his favorite things and what he likes to do?
Yes.
And did he report typical 8-year-old things such as children's TV shows,
Yes.
video games, food?
He did report Grand Theft Auto, which was not typical for an 8-year-old boy, but other than that, he talked about those things.
And he also talked about a cat
Yes.
that he had at home, a pet cat. You also performed the trauma symptom checklist for young kids?
Yes.
And that partly measures post-traumatic stress disorder,
Yes.
correct? And you weren't able to measure that.
I'm not sure what you mean. Let me look at that. Right.
Your report indicates, find a page, that'll refresh your recollection.
Yes. That is on page, doesn't have a page number, so.
Right.
But I see it, yes. Anxiety, depression, anger, PTSD, yes.
Okay, and you indicated you weren't able to measure that.
So when there's a low...
I'm just asking you.
Yes,
Is that what
right,
you
right.
wrote?
This is from the aunt again, all right, her
Okay.
scores. And
Because
so
you felt her scores didn't match up with
it
what
didn't, no, statistically it doesn't match up, all right?
Statistically, okay.
All right. So it wasn't any subjective on my part, that's statistical.
But you did indicate on the ADHD system rating scale that the scores were much lower than anticipated given by the aunt.
Yes.
Okay. The report indicates that Matthew was age appropriate in terms of sexual development.
Yes.
In terms of your indicating that Matthew suffered neurodevelopmental harm, you agree that that's a subjective finding by the evaluator?
Well, no, not based on testing. I mean, there are some neurodevelopmental delays, there's no question about those, all right?
Well, did you
And so-
indicate in your report that there was some subjectiveness to your evaluation?
There's always subjective, again, looking at understanding trauma, what it does to children, and so you take your clinical experience and your experience with other children and look at the history of what has happened to him or her in making those. So yes, absolutely there's clinical assessments, but testing is, there are neurodevelopmental delays. That's not my subjective opinion. Now, that doesn't mean, and its report states, that those couldn't be corrected in the future given supports, as I mentioned earlier.
I went ahead and numbered these pages, and I'm looking at what I numbered as page 9 of your assessment from April, Matthew, and under the traumagenic impact of maltreatment, the rating scale.
Yes.
Okay, you indicated it's completed by the evaluator, that's you.
Yes.
And you write it is a subjective measure.
Yes.
Okay.
That is.
And then on the next page, you have comments that I take to summarize your opinion from this scale.
Yes.
Okay, because it's immediately following
Yes.
the results of the scale test. And you're indicating, that's where you indicate in your report that Matthew's neurodevelopment has been harmed, correct?
Yes.
All right. You talked about Matthew's improvement in his IQ from the April meeting to the July meeting?
That's correct.
So you did do some testing of him in July to
That's the
determine-
only testing we did.
Okay.
That's the only testing.
All right. And did you indicate in your initial evaluation in April that the IQ delays that Matthew was having were likely due to educational, not being in school, basically?
Not being school and stimulation within the environment, normal kinds of
Okay,
things,
but
yes.
Your report indicated it was likely due to educational
Yes.
delays. All right. And so, do you know if Matthew was put in school?
Yes.
From the time you met him in April until July?
And he's been receiving tutoring as well.
All right. So do you believe that it was his, that his schooling helped improve his IQ?
I believe two things. One, it's the safety of the environment within which he has been. And two, it's been the educational, developmental exposure that will increase that. So I think it's a combination. It's not just educational, because if he's not safe, he's not going to learn.
Right. I agree. But would you also agree that in your report, you only indicated his overall intelligence is in the lower extreme, but some of these delays are likely due to lack of academic exposure,
Mhm.
correct?
Yes.
All right.
But certainly the conclusions talk
Well,
about it much more globally. Yes.
Thank you. You answered the question.
Yes.
Thank you. You talked about Matthew having a fragmented memory and kind of going from one idea to the next.
Yes.
All right. And would you say that's unusual for an 8-year-old?
Not an 8-year-old who's been traumatized.
An 8-year-old who hasn't been in school, who hasn't had social interaction?
I'm not sure what you're trying to say, ma'am.
I'm asking whether or not you found the fragmented memory to be explained by the lack of education, the lack access to education, the lack of being around others other than the immediate family, and just the fact of being 8.
I would say...
Judge, I'm going to object at this point because that's a compound question. Is the fragmented memory just because he was 8, or is it because he wasn't in school? I mean, you may have different answers for that.
I don't think I got it either, so could you restate it, Ms. Anderson?
Okay. How would you explain a fragmented memory?
So we know that children who are traumatized have fragmented memories. So their film in their head, their movie in the head that they show from what happened before, doesn't have a whole movie. It has clips, little segments, all right? It's very well documented in the research. And so fragmented memories here then affects your ability to consistently put a coherent whole together. So they tend to be tangential, all right? You're here, and then you're here, and then you're here. And certainly I've spent many times with 8-year-olds, all right? And some of any kid developmentally is 8 versus 16. However, for Matthew, given his history, given what I experienced, to me, it is clear that that's a fragmented memory given the innumerable traumatic memories that he has.
And that's something that would change over time, assuming he's in a healthy environment?
That will not change unless he gets therapy to address and to put a narrative together. That's what trauma therapy is about.
And you recommended trauma-based therapy?
Yes.
For Matthew, correct? And you conveyed that to Ms. Gordon, the aunt?
Yes.
And do you know if he's in therapy?
Yes.
All right. And have you received any therapy reports?
They wouldn't send them to us, all right? They would send them to the department, but I have not received any.
And I believe you also recommended that Matthew get into some sporting activities.
Yes.
Do you know if that was done?
I know he's at camp this week and participating, so I would assume that that will continue.
You talked about the importance of Gabrielle in Matthew's life and her role as she relates to Matthew. They're 10 years apart, correct?
Yes.
All right. And you indicated that Gabrielle had an average IQ?
Yes.
All right. Did you retest her?
No.
When you saw her in July?
No.
All right. Do you know what grade level Gabrielle is
She
at?
is somewhere between the 11th or 12th grade,
Okay, so she could conceivably graduate within a year?
conceivably.
All right. And did you speak to Gabrielle at all about her intentions to go to college?
Yes.
What did she tell you?
She really would like to go to college.
Did she indicate where she'd like to go?
Not at this point.
Did she indicate that she'd like to go to commuter college and stay
She-
at the aunt's house, or go to live on campus somewhere?
She did not communicate either.
But she used the words, "I want to go to college."
Yes, very clearly.
You talked about the importance of Matthew seeing Gabby daily, correct?
Yes.
Yes, okay. And you recognize that if Gabrielle goes away to college in a year's time, that most likely won't happen.
If she goes away to college, it wouldn't happen every day, no.
Now, Miss Gordon is Miss Blair's aunt, correct?
Great aunt.
Well,
Well, it's great aunt to the children.
Right, but
Yes.
she's Miss Blair's aunt.
Yes.
And great aunt to Matthew.
Yes.
All right. And did Miss Gordon tell you that she was aware that her niece, Miss Blair, had been emotionally impaired and mood disorders all her life?
She communicated that she was concerned about her emotional and mental well-being, yes.
But did Miss Gordon tell you that she knew that her niece, Miss Blair?
I will have to read it in here specifically, and if you could point it out exactly to what, I can't remember exact words. I know that she had indicated that she had concerns about mental and emotional
That was on the first page of your report.
Okay.
Is for clarification, which report?
Oh, from the April,
April 8th, yes.
Right, you see where you indicate right in
Yes,
the report
yes.
that Matthew's mom is emotionally impaired and has struggled with mood disorder her whole life?
Yes.
All right, and then on the next page, Ms. Gordon went on to say that she had that children would spend 2 weekends a month with her.
Yes.
Up until a couple of years ago when Ms. Blair stopped contact.
Yes.
All right. And did Ms. Gordon indicate to you that she knew of 2 prior CPS substantiated referrals for physical abuse on the children?
At this point in time, I am going to object in terms of relevancy. Whatever in the report can take, but if we're using this line of questioning to assume or to state in some way that the aunt is somehow to blame, she's not a person who had rights to these children. The blame goes from DHHS to the aunt. I mean, when does it come back to her own client?
Your Honor, if I could just respond.
The question is, so what does it have to do with best interests, whether the aunt knew or not?
Well, in questioning by petitioner's counsel, it was brought up about how good things are at the aunt's home and how the aunt would be able to provide stability and an appropriate, healthy home. So my line of questioning is going to her ability to protect these children.
I don't understand how she could protect children she didn't have a right to protect.
Well, the petitioner is asking that Ms. Gordon be placed in that permanent position. And they pointed out in the examination how healthy and how great everything is at the aunt's house. So I think I have a right to question, the aunt's
her
ability to
abilities,
properly
her
parent.
abilities. And you, excuse me, and you can do that as long as we don't get into whether or not the aunt's lack of knowledge somehow bears upon Mr. Berry's lack of knowledge, because we're way past that junction.
Yes, I agree.
But
I'm
if
going
it's limited just to the aunt's ability to care for the children, then you can ask it.
So I guess my line of questioning, Doctor, goes towards, do you have any concerns about Ms. Gordon's ability to parent when she knew of Ms. Blair's being emotionally impaired all her life, having mood disorders her whole life, having 2 prior CPS referrals for physical abuse of the girls, and having the children cut off from her unexplainably 2 years ago, and not seeing them more often?
I guess
Any concern about her
let me
ability?
frame it this way. We work with innumerable grandparents who know that their children are emotionally impaired, but who have no rights to their children and are very, very concerned. And so the fact that she knew those things, I in no way see that as a concern. She was concerned. She has no rights. I can tell you story after story after story of relatives who've been concerned, but because they have no rights, that they can't do anything. So that, to me, in no way reflects on her ability to care, nor protect, nor provide for those children.
You yourself have been a protective services worker, correct?
Yes.
For many years, right?
Yes.
Do you know what Ms. Gordon does in the profession?
I believe she was or still is a police officer.
She's a police officer?
Yes.
Okay. And so you don't think she would have known she could have called protective services?
Well, Judge,
She-
again, is this Ms. Gordon's best interest hearing, or is this her client?
This is sustained.
All right, I'll move on here. You indicated that Matthew smiled most of the time you saw him, correct?
All the time.
All the time?
Yes.
And you felt that was a defense mechanism?
Yes.
Did you ask the aunt, Ms. Gordon, if Matthew smiles all the time when she's around him at home?
Yes.
And what did she say?
Yes.
That he permanently walks around
Not
with a
permanently,
smile?
I mean, but when he meets people, engages with people, he's smiling all the time. You know, he certainly can get mad, he certainly can be sad. I'm not saying when permanent but I'm saying that that's his mode of coping and survival, is that.
But could he also be smiling because he's happy to see someone?
He does that indiscriminately, all right? And that doesn't mean that he isn't happy to see somebody. Yes, he's happy to see somebody, but determining that smile that's what it is different because of his experiences and how he's learned to survive. That's what I'm trying to communicate.
So he may be smiling, but not for the reasons that we may think?
Yes, absolutely.
You indicate that Matthew's in a crossroads in his development and he needs predictability and consistency. Don't all kids benefit from that?
I guess maybe you didn't read the report in terms of the magnitude of what this child has experienced. He's not a typical 8-year-old child.
But
And
don't
he
all
is.
kids benefit?
Judge, I would ask
Let
that,
him finish.
I would move to strike as not responsive. My question was, don't all kids benefit from having predictability and consistency?
and she did not phrase it as a yes or no question. She left the room open for him to answer in an open-ended fashion, and that's what he's choosing to do.
Let him finish his answer. What is the remainder of your answer, Dr.
That the magnitude of, at any age, a child could be at a crossroad. This is so significant given the magnitude of his trauma and what he's experienced, that this is a crucial, that's going to affect the rest of his life in terms of this decision about his future.
And the information that Gabrielle told you about Mr. Berry not supporting the family financially, where did she get that information from? She's a child.
Gabby was not a child. Gabby played the role of a parent. She was intimately acquainted with the financial status of that family, the rent money of that family, every detail. She was the parent to Gabby. And so she knew where the money was, she knew how much was there, who contributed. So clearly she was not in the role, even though, I mean, she was in that role even though she was a child.
Regarding the assessment of my client and his interaction with his son, would you say that Mr. Berry was appropriate with Matthew during their time together?
Yes.
You mentioned that Matthew, or that Mr. Berry gave his son a bear hug when he first
Yes.
saw his son, and Matthew didn't shy away from that.
No.
correct? Matthew didn't appear afraid of his father at
No.
all, correct? You indicated that in throughout your assessment of the father and son, there was good eye contact between father and son throughout.
Yes.
You indicated that my client actually led the MIM activities, correct?
Yes.
And that's something you wanted him to do?
Yes.
So it was appropriate that he did that?
Yes, absolutely.
And he engaged with Matthew in those activities?
Yes.
For instance, the building of a robot out of blocks, I
Yes.
believe? And when Matthew had trouble with that, how did Mr. Berry respond?
He responded appropriately.
He said, "I'll help you with
Yes.
that." All right. And Mr. Berry also colored pictures with his son, correct?
Yes.
And they talked about things. You said before the assessment started about movies and toys.
Yes.
That was kind of normal father-son talk, at least at that point.
I'm not sure it's normal father-son talk, just because they don't see each other, so it was much more of inquiry by Matthew, and so, but it wasn't inappropriate.
And Mr. Berry described to his son that his son's birth was the greatest day of his life.
Yes.
And in terms of providing structure, you had some concerns about that, but wasn't it an appropriate boundary to set by not allowing the son to have the energy drink because it's just for adults?
That, to me, was just common sense, right? To say you have a large energy drink and you don't give it to your 8-year-old son. So I didn't see that as structuring. I saw that as just common sense that you wouldn't give that to an 8-year-old.
And he also indicated to his son, at least at this visit, that they wouldn't be playing with his phone, correct?
Yes.
And that's something Matthew wanted, and Mr. Berry said
And I
no.
believe, and I'm 90% sure that I said to Mr. Berry that we're not going to use the phone in this. We're going to do the MIM and activities, so I did not want the phone a part of the interaction.
Now, you're not a treating therapist to this family, correct?
That's correct.
You had just met this family, you met Matthew twice and Mr. Berry once, correct?
I've met Matthew 3 times.
3 times?
Yes.
Okay. But you're not providing ongoing therapy?
No,
or
I'm
any
not.
therapy to this
No,
family, right?
I'm not.
All right. So you were a stranger to Mr. Berry when he met you?
Yes.
All right. And you were asking him to delve into his most personal family history of his own, correct?
I wouldn't say the most personal. It was personal. But yes, no, there were questions that are relevant to understanding how someone parents related to their childhood. So those are personal in the sense of needing to know some of that, yes.
And he did answer your questions eventually?
Yes, as I said, he had stopped, asked why, obviously was concerned, but I kept going and he did answer those questions, yes.
And when Mr. Berry was visiting with his son Matthew, Mr. Berry knew that you were viewing
Yes.
from some other room?
Yes.
correct? So he knew that he was being watched?
Yes.
And he parented? Okay. And do you think that would make a parent nervous to know
It
that
certainly
he's being
could.
not only watched but judged?
Certainly could make someone nervous, yes.
much emotion from my client, but he did tear up or cry with you when he was discussing with you what happened to his son?
Yes.
So that's certainly emotional.
Yeah, and I defined it. I put that in there for a reason, because it was an emotional piece that he teared up at that point. Yes.
So even though you were a stranger, he cried in front of you when he talked about what happened to his son?
Yes.
And Mr. Berry is very concerned, or expressed concern to you about losing his parental rights to Matthew, correct?
Yes.
And he asked you about that during your assessment of him, correct?
That's correct.
And Mr. Berry expressed to you some recognition of the horrific situation that his sons were put in when he lived with the mother, correct?
Yes.
And Mr. Berry recognized the importance that Gabrielle plays in Matthew's life, at least to some degree.
Certainly not to the degree that I thought was necessary to really understand it. There was some recognition of the big sister, but I can't imagine how he could not recognize that she was the parent and she was parenting Gabby when he had had contact with them.
Well, didn't Mr. Berry say to you at first that Gabrielle was parenting Matthew?
Yes.
He said, and then he
Changed
went on
that.
to say, well, they're really sister and brother. How do you know he wasn't just letting you know that he knew technically your sister and brother?
Because he was talking about role. I was talking about role. I wasn't talking about person.
That's what you were talking about.
Yes.
How do you know that's how Mr. Berry interpreted it?
It seemed to me very clear that it was parenting role that I was talking about. I can't know for sure, but certainly I was very articulate about the role she played.
And Mr. Berry seemed to recognize his son's needs in terms of needing to provide for his son physically, emotionally, financially. He expressed that.
He expressed that to me, yes.
And did Mr. Berry indicate that Ms. Blair ordered his visiting his son after he was released from prison in 2013?
Yes, he said that.
What's your understanding that would happen in terms of Matthew's placement if the court were to not terminate Mr. Berry's rights today?
I'm not sure what your question is, ma'am.
What is your understanding of what would happen to Matthew's placement if the court were not to terminate Mr. Berry's rights today? What's your understanding of what would happen to Matthew?
I would assume that he would just remain at the aunt's home until a permanent decision was made.
Okay. So you understand that if the court didn't terminate Mr. Berry's rights today, Matthew could become a temporary court ward?
Yes.
And that the court could order him, Mr. Berry, to complete a treatment plan?
Yes.
And the treatment plan would consist of making sure that he has appropriate housing for his son? Would that be your expectation?
I think there would be a lengthy treatment plan to say how is he going to do consistency, predictability, safety, security within each of the areas of financially, emotionally, educationally. So I would think it would be a lengthy plan.
Okay, so it would include housing, income, therapy,
Yes.
parenting classes, that sort of thing, correct?
Yes.
And Matthew could stay with his aunt and Gabrielle while Mr. Berry were working on a treatment plan, correct?
That's not my decision, but I would assume that that would be made.
Well, I know the aunt says she's willing to plan for
Yes.
Matthew long-term. Do you know if the aunt's willing to plan for Matthew short-term?
Yes.
She is?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so Matthew could stay in his current placement even if Mr. Berry's rights were not terminated today?
I would believe so. I can't say that
All right.
dogmatically, but I can say confidently.
All right, you said earlier that Matthew may be smiling, but not for the reasons we think, correct?
Yes.
Now, you also said that Matthew was crying at the end of the visit, correct?
Yes.
And you said he was crying because his father didn't have him play with the phone that
Yes.
day. How do you know that's really why Matthew was crying, and that he wasn't crying because he was leaving his father?
Because the first thing he said was, I thought I was going to be able to play with the phone today when he started crying. Okay? He didn't say, gee, Dad, I have to leave you. It was, I thought I was going to be able to play with the phone today.
Well, okay, so he didn't, he expressed a reason for why he was crying,
Yes.
correct? And you're taking that reason to be exactly why he was crying?
I believe that's why he was crying, yes.
But you don't take necessarily why he's smiling to be the reason why he's smiling?
Yes.
Okay. Do you foresee Matthew's emotional and educational, having emotional educational consistency, would that continue to improve him in terms of his cognitive ability?
Yes.
And his overall happiness?
Yes, absolutely.
And did Mr. Berry seem to recognize that Matthew needs special help in school? Did you even talk about that?
I'm not sure we talked about that specifically. We talked about some of the delays. I don't recall specifically saying, that he needs, well, we talked about that. I may have, I can't recall that specifically.
But Mr. Berry made it clear to you that he'd like to retain his parental rights to
Yes.
You indicated that Matthew's neural development could be improved over time?
Yes.
And how would that happen?
Because of stimulation, safety, the brain works on safety.
Okay.
And so accessing higher levels of thinking really demands all the things that I've talked about in terms of safety and predictability, and then they can make significant gains given the safety of an environment and relationship.
Did you ask Matthew how he feels about his father?
I can't recall specifically. I did not ask him the same questions that I asked Gabby because of her age, and what I believe is he has a hard time. I didn't want to overwhelm him. I don't ask kids, where they want to live at 8 years old. All right, it puts too much pressure on them. So he was happy to see his dad. So I did not probe into that with him.
You said that Matthew was happy to see his dad. Were you checking for any bonding between the two?
In a visit, you begin to see, as I talked about engagement, I was obviously explained concerns about some nurturing that needed to be there, some structuring that needed to be there. I think that at this point, I did not experience this parent-child bond. I felt comfort that he felt comfortable with his father, that he was able to engage with his father. He wasn't afraid of his father. But the significance of that bond I did not see.
Did you ask Matthew whether or not he wants to continue to visit with his father?
No.
You didn't talk
No.
about that? So we really don't know Matthew's position in terms of how much...
No, and I don't think we can really know, even if Matthew said, I want to see my dad, which my guess is he very well might, all right? This part of this relational Matthew that engages and has that, the depth of that relationship is different than wanting to see his dad.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Ms. Burns, you have some questions, correct?
Yeah.
We're gonna take a little break. Well, Dr. Hammond needs a break, so let's take a 5-minute break. 10-minute break.
10-minute break. All right, thank you.
Well, 24, I was gonna ask before it started, want to do it in the morning?
Let's see how far we can get. I mean, if we can't finish, Dr., before lunch, we can't, but let's at least see where we're at.
That would be great. I'd appreciate it if we could do that. Thank you, Your Honor.
Okay.